Hey everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, we're diving deep into something you'll definitely want to know about for those UPSC exams. It's the Immigration and Foreigners Bill 2025.
It's a huge one for sure. Anyone thinking about a career in policymaking really needs to get a handle on this thing.
Absolutely. It's set to totally change how India manages immigration. So we're going to break down all the key points and what they could mean for the country.
It's not just tweaking the old system. This bill aims to replace 4 big laws with one single comprehensive act.
Oh, wow. 4. That's a lot. Which ones are we talking about?
Okay, so we've got the Foreigners Act. That's from way back in 1946. Then there's the Passport Entry into India Act, 1920, the Registration of Foreigners Act, 1939, and the Immigration Carriers Liability Act of 2000.
So basically, the government is saying out with the old, in with the new when it comes to immigration.
Exactly. And one of the big changes is how strict they're getting with entry requirements. Like they're making it crystal clear that foreigners need a valid passport and visa to enter India no matter how they're arriving by air, land, or sea.
So no more sneaking across borders, huh?
Ugh.
But on a serious note, what happens if someone tries to enter without the right papers? What kind of consequences are we talking about?
They're not messing around. The penalties are pretty serious, up to 5 years in prison and a fine of 5 lakh rupees for entering without valid documents.
Okay, so that sends a strong message. But what if someone has a legitimate reason for being in India, but they don't have the right paperwork? Maybe they're fleeing a dangerous situation or something.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it's one of the reasons this bill is going to be debated a lot. It shifts the burden of proof from the state to the individual, so now people will have to prove they have a right to be in India, which could be very difficult for some.
Right. I can see how that could create problems. So basically, it's innocent until proven guilty in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And the role of immigration officers is also changing big time. They're getting way more power under this bill.
In what way? I mean, besides just checking passports at the border.
Well, they can examine documents at any time during a foreigner's stay in India. They can request information and even investigate potential forgeries.
So they're really stepping up their game.
They are. It's all about stricter enforcement, but it does raise questions about oversight and potential abuses of power.
Right. It seems like a lot of responsibility and power for one group of people. And it's not just immigration officers, universities, hospitals, and other institutions that host foreigners. They'll have a bigger role too, right?
Definitely. The bill says they have to report details about the foreigners they host to the authorities, so it's about keeping better track of who's in the country and where they are.
It all sounds very organized.
The goal is to make things more organized and accountable, but it's also raising some eyebrows about potential privacy concerns.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we've talked about the stricter entry requirements and all that, but what are the specific reasons someone might actually be denied entry into India?
National security is the top one if someone is seen as a threat to national security. They're not getting in, but it goes beyond that. They can also deny entry if someone is considered a risk to public health or could damage foreign relations.
So it's not just about keeping out criminals or terrorists.
No, it's broader than that, and the immigration officer has the final say in those cases with no room for appeal.
Wow, no appeal. That's a lot of power.
It is. It really highlights the authority they have under this new system, and leaving India is getting stricter. 2 valid documents are required for departure, and they can even stop someone from leaving if their presence is needed by the authorities, say for a legal case or something.
Right. I can see how that would be necessary in certain situations,
Yeah.
but it definitely creates a more controlled environment overall.
Yeah, there's a definite shift towards tighter control of who enters and leaves India.
So it sounds like this bill will have a pretty profound impact on how India interacts with the rest of the world.
No doubt it's going to be a game changer, and we're just scratching the surface here.
This is just the beginning, folks, so make sure you stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the potential consequences and controversies surrounding this bill. It's going to get really interesting.
Definitely don't miss it. All right, so we're back and ready to dig deeper into this Immigration and Foreigners Bill 2025. Last time we looked at some of the big changes it's proposing. Now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty, the potential implications and controversies, the stuff that really makes you think. And that's what's key for those UPSC folks, right?
You get it. This is where we go beyond just the facts and figures and start thinking about how this bill could actually play out in the real world. It's about connecting the dots and seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. One of the biggest debates around this bill is how it's going to affect that delicate balance between national security and individual freedom. The government saying tighter immigration control is crucial to protect India's interests, but critics are worried about potential impacts on civil liberties.
Yeah, I can see both sides of that. I mean, we talk about how immigration officers are getting more power under this bill, including the ability to detain people suspected of breaking immigration laws. Doesn't that raise some red flags about potential abuse of power and due process?
It definitely does, and that's where a strong independent judiciary comes in. They need to make sure this bill is implemented fairly and that everyone's rights are protected regardless of their immigration status.
So it's not just about having laws on the books, it's about making sure they're applied justly.
Exactly, and this becomes even more important when we consider how this bill could affect vulnerable groups like refugees and asylum seekers. India has a history of offering refuge to people fleeing persecution, but this new emphasis on enforcement and deportation could really challenge that.
Right. I'm thinking about the Rohingya refugees in particular. There are tens of thousands of them living in India, many without citizenship. How could this bill change their lives?
That's a tough one. It's a complex issue with both humanitarian and legal aspects. The bill's stricter rules could make it much harder for them to stay in India legally, and their lack of citizenship makes deportation almost impossible. So it's a real dilemma for policymakers.
It sounds like trying to balance security concerns with humanitarian obligations. How do you see this playing out?
Honestly, it's hard to say for sure, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. The world is watching how India handles this, and the government has to be careful about the diplomatic consequences of its decisions.
Speaking of the world, the bill's rules about carrier liability have also stirred up some controversy. The government thinks holding airlines responsible for bringing in undocumented immigrants will help reduce illegal immigration, but critics say it could backfire.
One concern is that airlines might get scared of those big fines and start denying boarding to legitimate travelers, especially those from certain countries or regions that could lead to discrimination and limit people's freedom of movement.
That's a valid point. It's all about finding that sweet spot between security and individual rights.
Exactly, and that's a theme that runs through this whole bill. But there's another big piece of the puzzle that we need to talk about, and that's the economic impact.
Right. India's economy is booming, and it needs skilled workers and foreign investment. Could this bill, with all its restrictions, make it harder for businesses to attract and keep talent from overseas?
That's another tough question. Policymakers are wrestling with the bill aims to crack down on illegal immigration, but they don't want to create unnecessary obstacles for legitimate businesses and investors. So finding that balance is going to be key.
So it's like walking a tightrope, right?
Exactly. You've got to keep all these different factors in mind, the economic side, the social side, the international implications. It's all connected.
This bill has so many potential consequences. It affects everything from individual rights to national security to the economy. It's mind-boggling.
And that's why it's such a crucial topic for UPSC aspirants. This bill forces you to think critically, to analyze and understand how all these different pieces fit together.
It's not just about memorizing the rules. It's about seeing the bigger picture and understanding the potential ripple effects.
Absolutely. You need to be able to look at this bill from different angles, and that's a skill that will serve you well no matter what career path you choose.
Well said. Okay, so before we wrap up this part, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the potential impact on India's demographics.
You mean the issue of illegal Bangladeshi immigrants, right?
Yeah, exactly. If this bill does what it's supposed to and reduces illegal immigration from Bangladesh and leads to more deportations, wouldn't that change the demographics of those border states, potentially causing social and political shifts?
That's a great point. It's a reminder that these policies we're talking about have real-world consequences for real people and communities.
It humanizes the whole issue, right? We're not just talking about abstract concepts here.
Exactly. And for anyone who wants to be a policymaker, that's a powerful thing to remember the choices you make affect people's lives.
It's a big responsibility, but also a huge opportunity to make a positive impact.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, folks, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the Immigration and Foreigners Bill 2025. We've covered a lot of ground, but we're not done yet. In this last segment, we're going to look at the potential legal battles the bill might face, how it stacks up against international standards, and the role of civil society in all of this. So if you're gearing up for those UPSC exams, this is for you.
Absolutely. This is where things get really interesting from a legal and social perspective. We're going to see how this bill might be challenged, interpreted, and ultimately put into practice.
So let's start with those legal challenges. I'm sure there are already lawyers and experts going over this bill with a fine-tooth comb. looking for anything that might not hold up in court.
Oh, for sure. A bill this big and this important is bound to attract a lot of legal scrutiny. One of the big questions is whether some parts of the bill could be seen as violating fundamental rights guaranteed by the Indian Constitution.
Yeah, like we talked about earlier, the bill gives more power to immigration officers and puts the burden of proof on individuals. Some people say that could infringe on rights like freedom of movement, the right to a fair trial, even the right to equality before the law.
Those are all valid points, and it highlights how important the judiciary is in a democracy like India. The courts will have to weigh the government's interest in national security and immigration control against the fundamental rights of individuals. It's a tough job, and their decisions will have a huge impact on how this bill plays out.
It's a delicate balance for sure. And it's not just about Indian law either, right? This bill will be looked at through the lens of international law and human rights standards too.
Exactly. India has signed on to various international agreements that protect the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. So legal experts and human rights groups will be checking if the bill's provisions on detention, deportation, and the treatment of refugees are in line with those commitments.
So if there are conflicts between the bill and India's international obligations, it could face criticism or even legal challenges in international courts.
It's definitely a possibility, and it shows how interconnected things are these days. What a country does within its own borders can have repercussions on the global stage.
That brings me to the role of civil society in all of this. You know, those NGOs, human rights groups, think tanks, legal experts, academics, and concerned citizens. They play a big role in holding the government accountable, advocating for human rights, and shaping public opinion.
Absolutely. They're going to be super important in this whole debate. They'll be analyzing the bill, raising awareness about its potential impact, and pushing for changes if they see it as a threat to rights or India's humanitarian traditions.
So we could see protests, legal challenges, lobbying efforts, maybe even campaigns to sway public opinion. It's about making sure the government hears the voices of the people.
Exactly. It's a reminder that democracy is more than just voting. It's about active citizenship and making sure laws and policies reflect values like justice, fairness, and human dignity.
This is getting really complex. It sounds like there are so many moving parts, and it's hard to predict what will happen. What advice would you give to our listeners, especially those who are preparing for the UPSC exams? How should they approach this issue?
Don't be afraid of the complexity. Embrace it. Dig into the details and analyze the bill from different angles. Don't just take things at face value. Question assumptions, challenge arguments, and form your own informed opinions.
And remember, those UPSC exams aren't about memorizing facts and figures. It's about showing that you can think critically, analyze information, and understand the forces that shape India's policies.
Exactly. You've got to connect the dots, see the big picture, and articulate your thoughts clearly and persuasively. And don't forget about the power of narratives. The way this bill is presented, the language used, the perspectives emphasize, all of that can sway public opinion and influence policy decisions.
So pay attention to how different groups portraying this bill and its potential effects, because you as future policymakers have the power to shape those narratives yourselves.
By staying informed, engaging in thoughtful discussions, and speaking up for what you believe in, you can help create a more just and equitable society.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. This has been a fascinating deep dive into the Immigration and Foreigners Bill 2025. We've explored the key changes, the potential impacts, the controversies, the legal challenges, and the role of civil society. It's a lot to take in, but remember, this is an evolving issue, so stay curious, keep learning, and never stop questioning.
And if you're prepping for those UPSC exams, be sure to check out the PIB article on the proposed Immigration and Foreigners Bill 2025. It's a great resource to help you really understand this complex topic.
And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. We love hearing from you. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.